Benjamin Netanyahu. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. It's an honor.
Thank you, my pleasure, and Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach. Israel is celebrating its 74th Independence Day, but on the backdrop of a shaky security situation, a recent terrorist wave, riots in Jerusalem. How do you think the current administration is handling the country these days?
Well, I think it's very hard to fight terror when you're dependent on the support of the Muslim Brotherhood Party. Obviously, that puts obvious limitations and also gives encouragement to the terrorists because they think they can do many murderous deeds and get away with them. So I think that weakens us. In addition, I think that being a composite government and not a coherent one that is dependent on merits and far left parties in Israel, it's very hard to put a strong position against Iran. So they have, I think, an incoherent position against the return of Iran to the flawed nuclear deal, or conversely, the rush of Iran to nuclear weapons without the deal. They should be there much stronger on the international scene, on the operational scene as well, which I hope they do. But obviously, publicly, they're not there. So on the two crucial elements of Israel's battle against terror and Israel's battle against the Iran nuclear program, I think they are not doing a good job.
So I want to address Iran in a second, but under your leadership, Israel has signed historic agreements, the Abraham Accords. Do you feel that the progress made is continuing today? And you mentioned terrorism and the Palestinians. Do you feel that Israel has largely abandoned an agreement with the Palestinians?
I think that the key to the Abraham Accords was Israel's strength. When the Gulf countries saw that Israel, under my leadership, was standing up to Iran and willing to do something very uncomfortable, confront an American president who was advancing an agreement that would endanger us, but would endanger them too, that's when they came to us. That, coupled with Israel's technological prowess, gave the bedrock to the Abraham Accords, which were then topped, if you will, with the positive involvement of the American presidency. But there was something else that was all the time undergirding this, and that was that we set aside the Palestinian veto, because for years I've been arguing, that the road to peace with the broader Arab world doesn't go through Ramallah and the Palestinian Authority, it goes around Ramallah. Because if you wait for the Palestinians to do a peace deal with us and then we'll get to a peace deal with the rest of the Arab world, we'll never have peace. And for a quarter of a century, we didn't have peace with another Arab state after Jordan, because the Palestinians don't want peace next to a state next to Israel. They want a state instead of Israel. So you don't want to wait for them. And the Abraham Accords, aside from being buttressed by our opposition to Iran and Israel's prowess and American support, was also done when we jettisoned the Palestinian veto. Is that the case now? It's very hard to tell. They keep talking about going to Abu Mazen as though they learned nothing. It's odd. And of course, when our partners in the Arab world see that, they begin to look at Iran too. And that's not a good idea.
Now, speaking of Iran, you were among the first and most vocal opponents of the original JCPOA, and yet Iran is, by some estimates, only weeks away from nuclear capabilities. Are we in a worse situation today than had we stayed in the nuclear agreement?
The original agreement would get you to where you are today, except with Iran having immunity from any military attack, having also billions, hundreds of billions of dollars to finance their terror and the expansion of a nuclear arsenal. Iran without a nuclear deal is a poor country. It's an isolated country. It's a country that doesn't have international legitimacy and doesn't have immunity from military attack. Iran with a nuclear deal is a rich country, breaking out of its isolation and receiving immunity from military attack from any of the signatories. This is a seal of approval for Iran to go nuclear. So whether it does or doesn't, the one thing you want to make sure is you can take action against it. With the deal, you're basically telling Iran, go ahead, do the deal. Look, with the deal, in 2 years, 2.5 years, Iran becomes a threshold nuclear state with a kosher seal of international approval. That's crazy. So you want to make sure that it never has the legitimacy, and ultimately there's no agreement that will stop Iran from arming itself. There's no agreement that ever stopped a rogue state from becoming a nuclear power. There was only military action against Saddam Hussein with the Iraq reactor, against Syria with the Deir ez-Zor reactor, against Gaddafi, who feared that the United States would do to him what Israel did to the others. But when there was no such danger in North Korea, it signed all the agreements, didn't make a whit of a difference. They became nuclear. So if you want to stop Iran from becoming a nuclear power, you need the combination of paralyzing, crippling sanctions on the one side, and the threat or realization of military action. If you don't have the two, no agreement will work. If you have the two, a lot of agreements would work.
The Iran deal is currently stalled, although the Biden administration seems to be pushing forward with a deal. What should Israel do in this situation? I mean, is a military option the only option left?
We should never accept any limitations on our freedom of action and on our obligation to act to prevent Iran, that seeks our destruction and openly declares that's its goal, to have nuclear weapons. The agreement should mean nothing to us.
Now, U.S. President Joe Biden is scheduled for a visit to Israel in the near future, some saying in an attempt to warm Israel to a potential nuclear agreement with Iran. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, we could try to warm him up. He has 4 mandates, if he's lucky, on a good day. I don't think the government is significant. It's not a significant factor today. I don't know how long it would last. I think it would have a hard time lasting because it's lost the public confidence. You took votes that you promised would go to the right and brought them to the left, and you do the opposite of what you promised. You're dependent on the Muslim Brotherhood for everything. So this government has lost its legitimacy in the eyes of many Israelis. Not the legal standing, that's not the issue, but the moral legitimacy. It really has lost it, and I think it's just a question of time before it's changed. So I don't think that's the issue. I don't think Israelis buy the nuclear accord. You can't warm them up to it. They understand that it's basically a highway paved with gold for Iran to have a nuclear arsenal, which first and foremost will be aimed at our destruction. So no amount of warming up will persuade Israelis to support this.
Now, it's no secret that you had very close relations with the Trump administration. Yet today, there are certain issues with regards to the Iran agreement, with regards to Israel's stance on Ukraine, that are causing a bit of tension between Israel and the United States. I mean, how do you view the Biden administration's policies towards Israel?
Well, they're sort of traditional democratic relations. You have to understand, in my view, America is the indispensable ally. Yeah, we have differences, and I've had differences with administrations, but Democrats and Republicans alike on a number of occasions. But it doesn't change the fact that there is a partnership between Israel and America that is based on a common identification of values between the American people and Israel. When the Iranians say death to Israel, death to America, death to the little Satan, death to the big Satan, they're basically discarding many of the differences that we think are important. They say, well, basically, the Israelis are like Americans, the Americans are like Israelis, we are you, you are us, you know. And in a deep sense, they're right. But obviously, I think it's important to continue the policies of strength and firmness against terrorist regimes like Iran. And I think that's the right policy for both America and for Israel.
Now, you mentioned the current administration is on shaky ground. Are we headed for another round of elections?
Maybe, could. But the fact that this government is not governing doesn't help us. When they say, you know, elections are bad for governance, right, this government is also bad for governance. And, you know, if you get a solid government after elections, then you solve it. I think there's a shift in Israeli public opinion. I feel it. It's very, very, very strong. You could sense it in the lobby of the hotel we're making this interview in. I sense it every day. I have the freedom to walk the streets these days. as opposed to being locked up in the prime minister's office. And what I hear from the public tells me that there will be, if we have elections, they will be very strong.
According to recent polls, the Likud under your leadership is getting stronger, but still not enough to form a government. So if we do go to elections, are the people of Israel facing another cycle of elections?
It's not what I say in our polls, because what you have to ask about likely voters, propensity to vote. And when you do that, we're already well beyond 60, well beyond 60. There is a change. And I think that this time you're going to see Likud voters and the voters of the national camp come out in droves.
And our final question, which I think so many of our viewers are asking, when will we see you in the Prime Minister's chair again?
I don't know. I'm enjoying the vacation now, but I think it may be cut very briefly. There are two options. There could be elections. There could be also an alternative government, national government, headed by me. These are the two options. Either that or new elections. We're pretty confident we can handle both. Anyway, I want to wish your viewers and the channel a happy Yom Ha'atzmaut. This is, with all our difficulties, we have to remember where we were 74 years ago. Basically a wind-tossed leaf. That's what the Jewish people were after the greatest destruction wreaked on any nation. And now we're sort of ranked in the top 10, which is not bad for a people that came back to life. So I think we should also count our blessings.
Former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. It was an honor.
Chag Sameach.